I never imagined that inheriting a lake would feel like stepping onto a battlefield. When my great-grandfather passed away, what he left me wasn't just land or paperwork. It was 2,100 acres of water, shoreline, forest, and history. Mirror Lake had been in our family since 1887, before roads were paved, before zoning laws, before the idea of a homeowners association even existed. As a kid, I spent summers fishing off the old wooden dock, listening to stories about how Silas Whitmore carved this place out of nothing but patience and stubborn belief. To me, it wasn't property, it was legacy. So when the probate paperwork cleared and the lake officially became mine, I thought the hardest part was over. I thought the future would be quiet, maintenance, conservation, maybe restoring the dock the way it used to be. I didn't know that the real inheritance wasn't the lake itself, but a fight that had been waiting for over a century to surface. The first sign came 6 months later. I was standing on the dock early one morning, the water perfectly still, when I noticed something taped to the post near the shoreline. White paper, official font. The kind of thing that never brings good news. I peeled it off and read the first line twice, convinced I'd misunderstood. Notice of violation, unauthorized water access and structure. It claimed the Homeowners Association now governed all lake usage. It demanded a monthly access fee. It ordered the immediate removal of my dock. It listed daily fines so high they didn't even feel real. And at the bottom, in neat legal language, it warned of liens, foreclosure actions, and further remedies. I laughed at first, an actual laugh, because it felt absurd. This dock had existed longer than every house in the surrounding development combined. The lake didn't belong to the HOA, it never had. Everyone knew that, or so I thought. Later that afternoon, she showed up. Cordelia Blackwood didn't introduce herself like a neighbor. She introduced herself like an authority. Perfect posture, expensive suit, clipboard tucked against her arm like a shield. She walked straight onto the dock as if she owned it, heels clicking against wood my great-grandfather had laid down by hand. She told me the HOA had recently updated its governance scope. She said the lake was now considered a shared community resource. She said my family's historical claims were outdated. She smiled while she spoke, but there was something sharp underneath it, like she was already tired of explaining things to someone she decided was beneath her. I told her there must be a mistake. That was the moment her tone changed. She said mistakes were expensive. She said resistance would only increase penalties. She said compliance would be easier for everyone involved. And then she handed me another packet of papers, thicker this time, filled with highlighted sections and sticky notes. Every page was designed to overwhelm, to intimidate, to make me feel small and unprepared. Before she left, she paused and looked back at the water. "You should know," she said, "the association doesn't lose these kinds of disputes." Then she walked away like the outcome was already decided. That night, I didn't sleep, not because I was afraid, but because something about it didn't sit right. I'd spent years as an army engineer. I understood systems, authority, jurisdiction. Nothing about her claims made sense. HOAs didn't just acquire lakes. They didn't erase deeds older than the county itself, and yet the confidence she carried told me this wasn't a bluff. This was something she'd done before. Over the next few weeks, the letters kept coming. Invoices for access fees I never agreed to. Warnings about non-compliant shoreline structures. Threats of daily fines that grew larger with each envelope. The language became more aggressive, more personal. They referenced enforcement actions, legal remedies, final notices that never seemed final. Then the county inspectors showed up, no warning, no call, just trucks pulling up, clipboards in hand, walking my shoreline like they were hunting for something. They said complaints had been filed. Environmental concerns, safety violations, improper dock anchoring. I watched as they measured, photographed, documented everything. And when they left, they found nothing. Not a single violation. That should have been the end of it. Instead, it made things worse. The HOA escalated. The fines increased. The letters turned into legal notices. They claimed the right to place a lien on my property. They hinted at foreclosure, as if you could foreclose on a lake that predated their existence. And every time, the signature at the bottom was the same name: Cordelia Blackwood, HOA president. People in the community stopped making eye contact with me. Neighbors who used to wave suddenly found reasons to be busy. I started hearing rumors that the HOA was untouchable, that Cordelia was a real estate attorney, that fighting her would be expensive, that the association had deep pockets and deeper connections. That's when I realized this wasn't about rules. It was about control. They didn't want the lake to be free. They wanted it regulated, monetized, leveraged. And my inheritance was in the way. I started documenting everything, every letter, every inspection, every interaction, dates, times, names. I installed cameras along the dock and shoreline, not because I expected anything dramatic, but because experience had taught me one thing: systems that rely on intimidation don't like records. Through all of it, I stayed quiet. I didn't respond to the letters. I didn't argue in public. I didn't show up at HOA meetings. That silence made them bolder. They assumed it meant weakness, and that assumption would become their first real mistake. Because while they were threatening, I was reading. Old records, property maps, archive deeds, anything that mentioned Mirror Lake before it had a name anyone recognized. I spent days in county offices, libraries, and historical registries, and buried in a file that hadn't been touched in decades, I found the document that changed everything. A deed dated 1887, not just for land, but for water rights, explicit, detailed, recorded long before modern property law reshaped everything. It outlined riparian authority, lakebed ownership, and access rights that didn't just predate the HOA, they made it irrelevant. I didn't celebrate when I found it. I didn't call Cordelia. I made copies. I secured originals. And I kept my mouth shut because by then I understood something important. This fight wasn't going to be won with anger. It was going to be won with timing. And the HOA, drunk on its own sense of power, was walking straight toward a cliff it didn't know existed. They thought they were dealing with a confused heir. They had no idea what I'd inherited, and they had no idea how much of themselves they were about to lose. The silence seemed to confuse them at first. After weeks of threats and escalating letters, I expected something loud, a confrontation, a knock on the door. Instead, what came next was quieter, colder, and far more calculated. The HOA stopped asking and started acting. The first charge hit my mailbox like an invoice from another universe. $500 for lake access usage. No explanation of how they calculated it. No reference to any agreement. Just a due date and a penalty clause. When I didn't pay, another letter followed within days, this one stamped final notice, warning that daily fines would begin accruing immediately. $10,000 per day. The number was so absurd it almost felt like a typo. Almost. But everything about the letter was deliberate. The formatting, the tone, the way it framed the fines as inevitable consequences rather than optional enforcement. It wasn't meant to be paid. It was meant to scare. Still, I stayed silent. That's when the anonymous complaints started. One morning I woke to find tire tracks near the shoreline that hadn't been there the night before. A few days later, county inspectors returned, this time citing environmental impact concerns. They walked the lake's edge, tested the water, took soil samples, and photographed the dock from every angle. They were professional, polite, and clearly responding to something that had been filed with urgency. They found nothing. Again. But the visits kept happening. Each inspection cited a different complaint: noise, wildlife disruption, unsafe structures, improper drainage. Every time the result was the same: compliant. No action required. The inspectors began to recognize me. One of them, a man who'd clearly been doing this a long time, shook his head as he handed me yet another clean report. "Someone really wants you gone," he said quietly. The HOA letters changed tone after that. They stopped pretending this was about compliance and started framing it as defiance. I was labeled uncooperative, obstructionist. One letter suggested my behavior posed a risk to community harmony. Another warned that my refusal to engage could be interpreted as admission of guilt. They referenced legal actions in vague but ominous terms, never specific enough to challenge. never clear enough to resolve. Cordelia never contacted me directly again. Instead, everything came through official channels, attorneys, letterheads, committees with long names and no faces. It was bureaucracy as a weapon, designed to exhaust rather than confront. Around the lake, the mood shifted. I noticed neighbors avoiding the shoreline when I was there. Conversations stopped when I walked by. A few people whispered warnings that the HOA had a history of making examples out of residents who pushed back, that fines had driven people to sell before, that Cordelia always won. I understood then that this wasn't just about me. The HOA wasn't enforcing rules. It was enforcing fear. The cameras I'd installed caught their first real mistake on a rainy Tuesday afternoon. The footage showed two figures on the dock long after midnight, moving carefully, deliberately. One of them loosened a support bolt, the other filmed it. The next morning I found a formal notice claiming the dock was structurally unsafe and posed a hazard to the community. They were creating violations. I saved the footage and said nothing. Instead I expanded the cameras, more angles, better coverage. I began logging every interaction in a dated journal, every letter, every inspection, every unexplained visit. Patterns began to emerge. The complaints always followed days when Cordelia or HOA board members had been seen nearby. The language in the complaints matched phrases from HOA emails almost word for word. That's when I reached out to a local attorney. Tommy Reeves wasn't the kind of lawyer Cordelia probably feared. He wasn't old. He didn't have a reputation. His office was small, his shelves lined with books instead of awards. But he listened, really listened. And when I showed him the deed, the inspection reports, the letters and the footage, his expression changed. "They're overreaching," he said carefully, "and they know it." He explained that what the HOA was doing bordered on harassment, that anonymous complaints filed in bad faith could carry consequences, that creating violations crossed into criminal territory. But he also warned me that fighting back too early could trigger exactly what they wanted, a costly public legal battle they could drag out indefinitely. "Right now," he said, "they think you're isolated. Let them keep thinking that." So I did. The HOA escalated again. They sent a notice claiming the lake itself was subject to new community environmental oversight. They demanded access for routine monitoring. They scheduled inspections without my consent. When I denied entry, they accused me of obstructing regulatory processes. It was a game of framing, each move designed to make me look unreasonable. Then came the lien notice. It claimed I owed $15,000 in accumulated fines and fees. It threatened foreclosure proceedings if payment wasn't made within 30 days. I stared at the paper for a long time, not because I believed it, but because I understood what it represented. They were all in. I drove to the county recorder's office the next day and confirmed what I already knew. No lien had been filed, no legal action had been initiated. It was a bluff, a dangerous one. Word began to spread that something wasn't right. A few residents quietly reached out. Stories surfaced, similar threats, selective enforcement, fees waived for some, weaponized against others. One woman told me she'd paid thousands just to make the HOA go away. Another said she'd sold her house at a loss rather than fight. This wasn't enforcement. It was extortion. The turning point came a deputy showed up at my gate one evening. Not an inspector, not an enforcer, just a man doing his job. Deputy Roy Hutchkins listened as I walked him through everything. The letters, the inspections, the footage. He didn't interrupt. When I finished, he asked one question: "Do you mind if I take a look at those complaints?" 2 days later, he came back. "All filed anonymously," he said. "All from the same IP address." The silence from the HOA after that was brief. Then came the emergency meeting notice. Mandatory attendance. Agenda unspecified. Legal counsel present. The kind of meeting that signaled either victory or desperation. Tommy and I reviewed everything again. The deed, the footage, the inspection reports. We weren't ready to reveal it all. Not yet. "Let them talk," Tommy said. "People show you who they are when they think they're winning." On the night of the meeting, the room was packed. Residents lined the walls. Cordelia sat at the front, composed, confident, surrounded by board members who looked less certain than they wanted to appear. She spoke first. She framed me as a problem, a threat, someone abusing loopholes to avoid community responsibility. She talked about unity, about fairness, about the need for strong leadership. Every word was polished, rehearsed, and designed to turn the room against me without ever letting me speak. When the floor opened for discussion, hands went up, questions were asked, some directed at me, some at her. She deflected smoothly, redirected blame, promised action. I didn't say a word. That more than anything unsettled her, because silence doesn't argue, it waits. And by the end of that night, as I watched the board members whisper among themselves and residents leave with more questions than answers, I knew something had shifted. The HOA had pushed too hard, too fast, and the weight of their own aggression was starting to show. They thought the pressure would break me. They didn't realize it was exposing them. And they had no idea how much evidence they'd already handed me. By the time the emergency meeting ended, I understood something I hadn't fully grasped before. Power doesn't panic when it's legitimate. It panics when it's pretending. Cordelia had been calm on the surface, but the cracks were there. The rushed agenda, the vague legal language, the way she kept repeating the same phrases as if saying them often enough would make them true. That night, I didn't go home angry. I went home focused, because now I knew exactly what they feared. I didn't confront the HOA after the meeting. I didn't respond to their latest notices. Instead, I did the one thing that would hurt them most. I slowed everything down. Silence became strategy. And while they scrambled to maintain control, I quietly began assembling the truth. The 1887 deed wasn't just old paper. It was specific, deliberate, and written in a time when water rights were treated as power, not amenities. My great-grandfather hadn't just bought land. He secured the lake itself. The deed outlined riparian authority in language that left no room for interpretation. Shoreline access, lakebed ownership, control of water usage, even mineral rights extending 200 feet below the bottom of the lake. It wasn't symbolic, it was absolute. Tommy spent weeks cross-referencing the deed with modern statutes. Pre-1900 water rights, especially those recorded before statehood, carried extraordinary legal weight. They didn't just outrank HOAs, they outranked zoning boards, municipal claims, and most regulatory overlays unless explicitly extinguished by statute. And in this case, they never had been. Every time the HOA claimed jurisdiction, they were exposing their ignorance, or worse, their intent. The more we dug, the clearer it became. The HOA had no legal authority over the lake. None. Their bylaws referenced shared amenities, but the lake wasn't listed. It never had been. There were no easements, no transfer agreements, no recorded changes in ownership. Cordelia's claims weren't just weak. They were fabricated, but we didn't move. Instead, we watched. And that's when we noticed something else. The HOA's finances didn't make sense. Tommy requested public records, budgets, expense reports, vendor payments. At first glance, everything looked normal. Landscaping, maintenance, legal fees. But when he slowed it down, when he traced payments instead of categories, patterns emerged. Repeated NSFers to the same consulting firms. Legal invoices with vague descriptions. Environmental assessments that never produced reports. And always the same signatures. Cordelia Blackwood. We hired a forensic accountant quietly. No noise, no confrontation, just numbers. The deeper the audit went, the uglier it got. Over 3 years, nearly $200,000 had been funneled through shell companies linked to Cordelia, consulting firms that existed only on paper, environmental reviews that never happened, legal retainers that led nowhere. This wasn't overreach, it was exploitation. And then, unexpectedly, the HOA made another mistake. They hired a private investigator. His name was Marcus Webb, and he was supposed to dig into my background. Find something, anything they could use. Past disputes, financial issues, environmental violations. Instead, he found a wall of documentation and a trail of HOA misconduct that was impossible to ignore. A week later, he asked to meet. He didn't record the conversation. He didn't bring paperwork. He just told me what he'd found and why he couldn't stay quiet. The HOA had asked him to fabricate evidence, to exaggerate environmental risks, to pressure witnesses. When he refused, they offered more money. That was the moment the case stopped being defensive. It became proactive. We didn't expose anything yet. We didn't leak documents. We didn't go to the media. Because the most dangerous thing you can do to a corrupt system is let it believe it's still in control. Instead, we let Cordelia escalate. She issued another notice, this one claiming the HOA was pursuing eminent domain options to seize the lake for the good of the community. It was legally absurd. HOAs don't have eminent domain power. They never have. But the language was designed to intimidate, not inform. Tommy smiled when he read it. She just crossed a line she can't uncross, he said. Behind the scenes, Deputy Roy continued connecting dots. The anonymous complaints, the sabotage footage, the IP addresses. What started as harassment now looked like coordinated abuse of process. He filed his own reports, quietly, methodically, waiting. Meanwhile, we prepared. We assembled a timeline that showed everything in sequence. Every notice sent before a complaint, every inspection following a board visit, every financial transfer aligned with enforcement spikes. We compiled inspection reports showing full compliance, scientific data confirming the lake's ecological stability, water quality tests, wildlife surveys. Everything Cordelia claimed was endangered was demonstrably healthy, and still, we said nothing. The HOA scheduled another public meeting. This time, they advertised it as a decisive action session. They promised resolution, finality. Residents showed up expecting fireworks. Cordelia sat at the front again, but something about her confidence felt forced. Her eyes flicked to the door more than once. She spoke at length about responsibility, about the need to protect shared resources, about how difficult leadership decisions sometimes upset individuals for the greater good. She never mentioned the deed, never mentioned jurisdiction, never mentioned the law. When she opened the floor, I stood. It was the first time I'd spoken publicly since the conflict began. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't accuse. I asked one question. Can you show us the document that gives the HOA authority over Mirror Lake? The room went quiet. Cordelia smiled and said the matter was under legal review. That documentation would be provided at the appropriate time, that the HOA had acted on council's advice. I nodded and sat back down. That was all I needed, because now, in front of everyone, she'd confirmed what we already knew. She had nothing. The meeting ended without resolution. Residents left unsettled. Whispers followed Cordelia down the hall. The illusion of certainty she'd relied on for years was gone. That night, Tommy and I finalized everything. The deed, the financial audit, the footage, the witness statements, the inspector reports, the PI's testimony, the deputy's findings. We didn't prepare an attack. We prepared a reveal. Because when truth finally comes out, it should arrive whole, undeniable, impossible to spin. Cordelia thought she was tightening her grip. In reality, she was building the stage for her own collapse, and when the lights came on, there would be nowhere left for her to hide. The night the HOA finally lost control didn't begin with shouting. It began with confidence. Cordelia Blackwood walked into the community hall like someone who believed the ending had already been written. Her posture was straight, her expression calm, her steps measured. This meeting, she'd told residents, would resolve the lake issue once and for all. Legal counsel would be present, final determinations would be made, order would be restored. But every chair in the room was filled. BR people stood along the walls, others lingered near the doors. Word had spread that something important was about to happen. Channel 7's news van was parked outside, its presence explained away as routine coverage of community governance issues. Cordelia didn't object. In fact, she seemed pleased by it. She had no idea why they were really there. But the meeting was called to order, formalities, minutes, agenda. Cordelia spoke first, as always. She framed the conflict as a simple dispute that had been distorted by misinformation. She spoke about fairness, about shared responsibility, about her duty as president to protect community assets. She referenced environmental risks without citing data. She referenced legal authority without naming statutes. Then she introduced the motion.er. The HOA would pursue acquisition of Mirror Lake through available legal mechanisms, including eminent domain if necessary. A murmur ran through the room. Before anyone could respond, Tommy stood. He didn't ask permission. He didn't interrupt. He waited until Cordelia finished speaking, then addressed the room in a voice that was calm, steady, and precise. "My name is Tommy Reeves," he said. "I represent Ezra Whitmore, and before any vote takes place, there are documents this community deserves to see." Cordelia's smile faltered. Tommy began with the deed, not a copy. The original, dated 1887, recorded, verified. He explained what it was, where it came from, and why it mattered. He explained riparian authority in plain language. He explained that the lake was never part of the HOA, that it had never been transferred, annexed, or subjected to community governance, that no amount of bylaws or board votes could override a right established before the HOA existed. He let the room absorb it. Then he moved to the inspection reports, county after county, year after year, all confirming compliance. No violations, no environmental damage, no safety concerns. Every claim the HOA had made collapsed under the weight of official documentation. Cordelia tried to interrupt. Tommy didn't stop. He showed the footage next. Surveillance video of two individuals on the dock at night, adjusting bolts, creating the very hazards the HOA later cited as violations. Gasps rippled through the room. Someone recognized one of the figures. It was a board member. That was... When Cordelia stood up, she accused Tommy of manipulating evidence. She claimed the footage was taken out of context. She demanded it be excluded from the record. Tommy nodded. "Of course," he said, "which is why we provided it directly to law enforcement." Deputy Roy stepped forward. He didn't speak at first. He just placed a folder on the table. Inside were printed IP logs, complaint records, timestamps, all tracing anonymous filings back to the same source. The HOA office. Cordelia's face drained of color. The room was no longer murmuring. It was buzzing. Tommy moved to the finances. He projected spreadsheets onto the screen, line items, transfers, vendor names. Then he highlighted the shell companies, showed how they connected, showed how money flowed from HOA accounts into entities controlled by Cordelia. He didn't accuse. He let the numbers speak. Over $200,000. 3 years, no services rendered, no reports produced, just money disappearing. A resident stood up and demanded an explanation. Cordelia tried to speak. The words didn't come easily now. Then Marcus Webb stood. He introduced himself as the private investigator hired by the HOA. He explained what he'd been asked to do, what he'd refused to do, and what he'd documented instead. He handed Deputy Roy a signed statement. The room erupted. Cordelia shouted that the meeting was out of order, that the HOA was being ambushed, that this was harassment. Deputy Roy raised his hand. "This meeting is over," he said, "but this investigation isn't." He turned to Cordelia and asked her to step aside. She refused. That was when the cuffs came out. The arrest wasn't dramatic. No shouting, no resistance, just the quiet sound of metal closing around wrists that had signed hundreds of threatening letters. As she was led out, the room fell silent. The board members sat frozen. Residents stared at the space she'd occupied for years, suddenly empty. The authority that had ruled through fear evaporated in seconds. The news cameras captured everything. Within hours, the story was everywhere. HOA president arrested for embezzlement and fraud. Historic water rights vindicated. Community governance under investigation. By morning, board members were resigning. The HOA's legal counsel withdrew. Emergency notices went out suspending all enforcement actions. The fines against me were rescinded. The lien notice vanished as if it had never existed. But the real collapse happened quietly. Emails surfaced, internal messages, evidence of selective enforcement, of intimidation strategies, of residents targeted for convenience or profit. What had once felt like isolated incidents revealed themselves as part of a system, and systems don't survive exposure. The county opened its own review. The state HOA oversight committee followed. Accounts were frozen, records subpoenaed. The association's authority was suspended pending restructuring. I stood on the dock the next morning, watching the water move the way it always had, unbothered, unmoved. For the first time in months, there were no letters waiting, no inspectors scheduled, no threats looming. Cordelia had believed power came from position. She learned too late that it comes from legitimacy, and legitimacy, once stripped away, leaves nothing behind but consequences. The lake was quiet again, but everything around it had changed forever. The days after Cordelia's arrest felt unreal, like the echo after a storm finally passes. For months, everything had been noise. Letters, threats, meetings, inspections, deadlines designed to keep me off balance. Then suddenly, there was nothing. No envelopes in the mailbox, no certified mail, no final notices. The silence this time wasn't strategic. It was the sound of a system collapsing under its own weight. The HOA's authority was suspended within a week. Board members resigned one by one, some quietly, others in a rush that made it clear they wanted distance from anything bearing Cordelia's name. Legal counsel formally withdrew, citing irreconcilable ethical concerns. The association's accounts were frozen pending investigation, and a court-appointed administrator stepped in to keep basic services running. For the first time since I'd inherited the lake, I felt like I could breathe, but relief didn't come all at once. It came in pieces. One afternoon, a woman knocked on my door. She introduced herself slowly, like she wasn't sure. She had the right. She told me she'd lived in the community for 14 years, that she'd paid thousands in fines she never understood, that she'd been warned not to ask questions. She didn't ask for anything, just wanted to say thank you. She wasn't the last. Over the following weeks, stories surfaced that mirrored each other almost perfectly. Residents targeted for minor issues while others were ignored. Selective enforcement used to pressure sales, fees quietly waived for friends of the board. People who challenged decisions suddenly buried in violations. What I'd experienced wasn't unique. It was simply the first time the pattern had been interrupted. The investigations moved quickly after that. The forensic audit confirmed everything Tommy's accountant had found, and more. Shell companies traced back to Cordelia. HOA funds diverted to personal development projects. Legal retainers paid to firms that never represented the association. Environmental studies invoiced but never performed. The final figure surpassed $200,000, and that was only what could be cleanly documented. Restitution was ordered. It didn't undo the damage, but it mattered. HOA reserve accounts were replenished. Outstanding fraudulent fines were refunded. Liens issued under Cordelia's authority were formally voided. For many residents, it was the first tangible proof that what they'd endured wasn't their fault. The emergency election was held 6 weeks later. No speeches, no prom. ISIS. Just a room full of people who wanted competence instead of control. Mavis Lane was elected president unanimously. She hadn't campaigned, she hadn't asked. She was chosen because everyone trusted her. And after what we'd been through, trust mattered more than ambition. One of her first actions was dissolving half the committees Cordelia had created. Layers of oversight that existed only to confuse were removed. Enforcement procedures were rewritten. Financial transparency rules were adopted. Independent audits became mandatory. The HOA didn't disappear, but it became something smaller, quieter, and accountable. As for the lake, its status was finally officially clarified. The county recorder updated the records to reflect the 1887 deed in modern terms, not because it was required, but because no one ever wanted this confusion again. The lake was recognized as privately owned, with access governed by voluntary agreements rather than coercion. The HOA's jurisdiction ended at the shoreline, exactly where it always should have. That's when the idea for the Conservation Trust came up. It wasn't about control, it was about stewardship. Mirror Lake had survived more than a century because it had been respected, not exploited. My great-grandfather understood that. He protected it, because he knew power over water carried responsibility. I wanted to honor that, not just legally but practically. The Mirror Lake Conservation Trust was formed with one purpose: preservation wit. Haut exclusion, environmental monitoring, sustainable access, education, transparency. Scientists were brought in to establish baseline data. Water quality was tested regularly. Wildlife surveys were published publicly. Nothing hidden, nothing politicized. The lake didn't need protection from people. It needed protection from abuse of authority. Tommy's life changed too. What started as a small case in a quiet office became something much bigger. Calls came in from other communities. Similar stories, similar patterns, HOAs operating in gray areas, counting on residents not knowing their rights. Tommy didn't advertise. He didn't need to. Word spread on its own. Deputy Roy was promoted before the year ended. Officially, it was for exemplary service. Unofficially, everyone knew it was because he treated harassment like what it was, abusive process, and refused to look away. As for Cordelia, the legal process moved at its own pace. Charges were filed, pleas were negotiated. The outcome wasn't dramatic, but it was decisive. Disbarment proceedings followed. Restitution orders stood. The authority she'd built her identity around disappeared, replaced by court dates and consequences she couldn't negotiate away. I didn't attend the hearings. I didn't need to. Closure came one evening, months later, when I returned to the dock at sunset. The water was calm, reflecting the sky in soft colors. No signs, no notices, no cameras except the one still quietly recording, now out of habit rather than necessity. I sat on the edge of the wood and thought about how close this place had come to being turned into something transactional, regulated, leveraged, controlled, and how quietly it had resisted. Power doesn't announce itself when it's real. It waits, it endures, and when challenged, it doesn't shout. It proves. The lake was never the prize. Understanding that was